Hey, and welcome to Out of Hiding, a podcast where we focus on growing in God by seeking His truth. Hosted by Dan Morrow and David Flores. David, how you doing?
I'm good. I'm sore, but it's good.
CrossFitting?
CrossFitting, you know.
You drinking the Kool-Aid?
I'm drinking the Kool-Aid right now. So hopefully it lasts and goes good.
Yeah?
Yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited for our guest today.
Yeah?
Yeah, I look forward to this one.
Okay. You got any questions already built up?
I do.
Why do you look forward to it so much?
Huh?
Why do you look forward to it?
I don't know. I just, first of all, I'll introduce our guest. We have Greg Dickey, So usually Dan gives the good introductions, but I'm looking forward to it because you're around the church a lot, and I see you, and you're serving, and you're hustling people at the door.
The church stalker.
Yeah. So, no, yeah. and also, I'll just fire away my first question. How is it watching your wife do a podcast and like sitting down and watching that? Because I never got to really ask you that too, Dan. Maybe you can help answer that too. How is that? Like, what is it awkward? Is it? I don't know. What is that? How does that look like? How does it feel?
Well, I would say humbling. I love my wife. She's the best thing, next to Jesus for me. I call her and if you ever look at my phone, you'll see I call her my smoking hot bride. And I've always called her my bride, even from day one. But watching her I was very proud just of her to, be able to hold it together. Because there was a lot of stuff she didn't tell. And a lot of stuff that, she opened up and shared, which was really good. And I thought she did a fantastic job. I was just very honored. It made me proud of her, I would say.
Was there any time like there was a perspective revealed that you hadn't heard her talk about, or did you kind of see everything coming?
I knew everything that she talked about. Nothing was I didn't know that.
Yeah.
There wasn't any of that. I think I knew, or I know I knew everything. I didn't know what all she would talk about. I didn't know how much. I thought she'd talk more about freedom ministry than her story. I really didn't know that she was going to talk as much about her battle with depression that she did. And by the way, one thing she didn't say that I'll just say that I'm really proud of her is that, she talked about how she got on some medication, but she is completely off of that now. And she is just, she went through that and that helped her so much. But, just to tell a little of her story, it's to be able to be completely healed. Mm-hmm. It was just awesome.
So back to that, the depression. She did say last week that she didn't even tell you about it. But did you have like a feeling maybe she was going through something, or were you just like, nope, she's good, and maybe kind of kept the blinders on? And how does that work? Because some spouses, they're like, well, I was depressed, my husband didn't know, But for me, sometimes I feel like, I'm quick to like my wife, if she's feeling sad, I'm like, something's missing, something's wrong.
Yeah.
So did you feel that way, or were you just kind of like, maybe she's going through something, I'm just going to let her do her thing, or you just didn't know at all?
I didn't really know. I didn't know that that's what they called it, the title of it. I mean, I'd heard of depression. I've heard of, people that have struggled with different things like that. And I just, but I also know that men and women change throughout life. We go through different cycles, just like a child, a teenager, who goes through the different phases of the 3-year-old, then puberty, and then, all the different stages. Well, adults go through different stages too. And I thought, okay, this is something that, women go through or something. I didn't really know the extent of it, but we've always had an open relationship and talked about it. So I never felt like she was hiding anything from me. But when she started sharing with me, especially after talking with the lady who was our pastor's wife that she talked with, that just became an amazing, both of them were amazing mentors of ours throughout at that season of life, it was just like, oh, okay. Yeah, I do see that now that I really look at it.
Yeah.
So.
Well, I think based on what she talked about in here, it would be hard to pinpoint because she was very good at hiding everything.
Yeah.
She was living basically a false life of I'm perfect. I got everything together. That's kind of what I gathered out of her sharing was once she got so tired of carrying all these pieces, that's when depression hit like the hardest. And it'd be hard to pinpoint that when someone's, got a really big, nice house of cards built. Yeah. It's all clean and pretty, and they're presenting one way. It's sometimes it's hard to. There's no reason to go looking, right?
Right.
Because everything on the outside looks great.
And it did seem that way. We were in church all the time. We were going, and things were going well, and I felt like life was good, and life was good, except for a few things like that we were dealing with.
Yeah.
But because from the way I was raised and she was raised, we were raised similar. It was really more of the, we always laugh and call it the bunkers meet the cleavers, and she was more of the bunker family, loud and just. If you know the bunkers, I don't know. Just they resolve things a little bit different.
Yourself there.
I probably did. I am 55.
Are you talking about Archie Bunker?
Yeah.
My grandpa loved that show.
I'm so lost right now.
I watched a couple of episodes, but I don't know.
So you had one family that was very irate. The way that they resolved everything was loud and anger, but by the end of the show, they had resolved things. Mm-hmm. The Cleavers, which were even before me, but I watched all the reruns, was very calm. There was no raising it. If they raised their voice, it was because, someone said a bad word, which was stop it or something like that. It was nothing, we laugh at it. June wore her pearls and cleaned house in her dress all the time. It was very prim and proper. They went to Sunday school. That was kind of the way I was. And only I was kind of the Eddie Haskell a little bit of the family that people didn't realize. Some people knew, but I was the baby of the. She was the firstborn. That's where we're different. She was the firstborn, the leader, the one that's always the decision maker, the leader of the kids. I was the baby. I was the baby of both sides. My grandparents. I was the youngest nephew, the youngest grandchild, the youngest everybody. So I could just put on the face and. They would say, "Oh, Greg, he's so good," and I'm like, "Yeah, I am. I just think I am." So that's kind of some of the way I put on.
So here's the big question everybody's going to want to know.
All right.
She loved to go to the bars and go dancing, and you didn't want to. What's up?
All right. So, wow. I knew this question was going to come up.
So, it couldn't not.
No, it couldn't, since you said you were going to ask me. Yeah. So the deal is with that, yes, I have been to dancing. Mm-hmm. We've danced. We've done all two-step, three-step, all that. She was very good. I got along. I could go with her. But at the time, at that particular time in my life, I was battling trying to stay away from the bars because I talked about me being this good kid. I was raised in church. My dad was in leadership in the church. He was, depending on which church. I call myself a mutt because of the different churches I was raised in. And he was in leadership a lot of those times. My mom was the church organist. They taught Sunday school. They were just really involved. And so probably right after high school, I did like a lot of kids did and started hanging out, with the wrong crowd when I left home. And I started, going, like I was a music major in college. That's where I thought I wanted to go, was music. And
what did you want to do with music?
Well, so I was in band, and I sang in the choir and did all that with our church, and then I played piano and played trombone. So I thought that's the way I was going. I got invited to play with the United States Air Force Band, once there was 3 people that were chosen out of our school to get to go, kind of a recruiting thing. And then I, went did solo and ensemble, made it state, and did a lot of things like that. And I mean, I was primed and ready to go to college, to do band. And I started there, and I thought, this is not the way I want to go. So with that, going that route, I mean, I'd changed my major so many times it wasn't even funny. But throughout that process, I would play in church orchestras. In like one church I went to when I left home, I went to this church and they said, "Hey, you play. We want you to play in our orchestra and we'll pay you." I said, "Cool." I was a single kid. I'll take anything.
Yeah.
And so I'd show up on Sunday morning with a hangover, playing in the band, because I'd just been out the night before, going out with friends and who knows what, and staying out late, and then I would show up that Sunday morning, praising Jesus with a major headache, and then do it all over again. And that's just kind of, and again, I don't have a problem with people that drink. I've just, throughout that time, I've had to stop.
Was that before you met Chris? When you were doing singing in the choir and having hangovers and stuff?
It was, oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
That whole side was, I mean, we still did choirs when we were married.
Yeah.
I mean, we sang in different.
But you noticed that, so you stopped, and then that's why when you met Chris, that's why you weren't, you're like, I'm giving this up.
Yeah. So she mentioned the guy that introduced, that where we ended up showing up. That guy who was a groomsman in my wedding, he was actually a seminary student. And he and I worked in retail together at the time. And I would go to him and we would have some really good conversations. And he knew I was single just like he was. And he knew some of the things I'd struggle with, getting in the wrong crowds. Because when you get out of high school, you're in your youth group. And then when you leave church, you're in that awkward stage. If you don't go, everybody goes off to college. You kind of go off. And if you don't have that grounding and that stability, then, you're prone to whatever. And that's something when we raised our kids, we really worked at opening things up for them so that let's talk about it at home. Let's deal with it at home. And because, I can't tell you how many people, even when we were raising kids and before, would say, I'd ask them, "Is your daughter or son dating?" "Oh no, we're not going to do that till they're after high school." And Chris and I would just look at each other like, why? That's the worst thing you can do. "Oh, they'll figure it out." And then you see what happens is they go out after high school and college. They don't know how to date. They don't know what to do. And they just go crazy. And so we made it a point to encourage our kids to date, teach our kids to date, and, say, "Yeah, we want you to date." And they dated all kinds of people.
Yeah.
Non-believers and believers. It wasn't all just the youth group kids. Mm-hmm. So I know I'm.
No, actually, I want to sit there for a
places.
little bit in that spot you just talked about. Going to the youth group, and then after you graduate high school, that little space between college, I guess you could say, or if you don't go to college, just from I guess 18 to about 21, it's real confusing. And Dan hits it a lot, and youth talks about it, but nobody really talks about that as much as I feel like they should, because it's very it's like, I don't know. I even for my life after I graduated, I was like, well, what do I do? I mean, I feel like I got to have a family before I can start sitting in church with the big, kids and whatnot. And it's very confusing. Yeah. So hit on that, Dan, a little bit. I'm throwing you on the spot, but.
Well, I mean, it's just an observation I've seen is there seems to be an unspoken division between youth and regular church, just across the board. I'm not singling any church out, anything like that. What I've experienced and what I've grown up in is when youth get out of youth, it's like there's not much that takes place in their life different from the age of 17 and 364 days to the age of 18. Mm-hmm. However, a big shift happens. At 18, they're no longer can do this and no longer can do that. You got to get out of that and get into this, and you got to go here and you got to go there. There is not a real transition there, and I feel like we dropped the ball there because we just maybe that's a good thing. I don't know, but I do know it causes lots of people to struggle in that arena. They feel maybe abandonment is one of the things kids that age feel like they're they have to get out of youth unless they want to serve in youth. And sometimes that don't work because they're going off to college and they're meeting new friends. They're doing the whole new thing. But I do believe there are some ministries that are filling that gap.
Yeah.
But I think as a whole, the church could do a little bit better about connecting the youth with the main body of the church because it's the same body.
Mm-hmm.
But here at Radiant, we have lots of kids that they come to youth, but they're not involved at church at all.
Yeah.
Their parents don't come. They don't come. They don't come on Sunday morning. They just come to youth. So there's automatically a disconnect right there. So my goal is to try to bridge that and say, hey, youth is just a part of it. Like, it's very important to be a part of the big body of church too,
Yeah. That was a hard time. Chris talked a little bit about it when she did her podcast about where we realized we had to teach our kids how to be adults because, they reached that point and, one of them went to college. The other one did college here locally. But both of them, we had to, all their friends went away and did all the college thing. And if, you don't go there and even going to college, if you're not grounded and trained on how do you meet friends, because you're going into a new life, you can crash or fail, crash or burn, or, one of those, or if you've got a good support, you can survive. And that's one thing that we did was, or that I did whenever I was single is I didn't have that support, because all my friends had left and I was searching. And so where I searched, was people that I worked with. And I worked with those people and, we were going to parties, we were going out and trying who knows what and with who knows what and with who knows who, just you name it, we probably did it. And I mean, fortunately I didn't get into the drugs or anything, but, we were always out partying. And then I would, every once in a while I'd show up to church. I mean, if I was getting paid, I would be there, by golly, because I needed that extra, whatever it was, just because that was, as a single starving kid who's living off Doritos and, the next free meal, then you want it.
I want to shift gears.
Yeah.
Because I want to hear the other side of the story.
Okay.
So when Chris finally, everything hits the fan.
Yeah.
And she comes and is like, I'm dealing with depression. There's a couple ways that you could take that. I'd like to hear how you took that and how you dealt with it, because that's a hard thing to hear. Your partner come at you from maybe nowhere and just all of a sudden say, I'm depressed. What was that like?
So the big thing that helped is she had women in her life. I had men in my life that were mentors of mine that spoke into my life. I learned that early on from, a pivotal moment. I'd say a defining moment in my life was when I was 25. We'd been married 2 years, not to get off on that, but that's when I got more serious about life. Having that throughout those years, having those men in my life that were speaking into me, that were mentors of mine, that were my Barnabases, but also my Pauls, which you would call those that are, mentors and really your father figures that aren't your dad. And those men that you could go to. So I had those men.
So you went to those men with this?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that was your first step?
Yeah. Cause we talked about it. Mm-hmm. At first I was like, is this something I did?
Well, yeah, I was fixing to say, the first response is to take it internally and go, what did I do?
Yeah, that's where, are we okay? Oh, no, we're okay. And then I started realizing and understanding what it is. And so she talked to our, pastor's wife, who was a dear friend, and I was already in a group with her husband, our pastor, where I was in a, men's group with him. And so I was able to talk with him, say, is this okay? And talk with some of those other guys who were like, yeah, this is okay. And the one lady that she mentioned who was my best friend at the time, her husband was. She mentioned a lady that sat and held her hand, she cried with. And that lady, who was just a good friend, he and I coached our boys together for years in baseball. And he was someone that I could, because he was a few years ahead of me, and he was someone that I could sit down and know, oh, okay, this is how you dealt with it. So it helped.
Back up a little bit. Chris said at one point she ends up just running out of a room crying, and just complete meltdown. So that day, what do you remember about that day?
I don't remember a lot about that day. Just, again, it was, I don't remember, I don't really remember a lot about that particular time, specific event. But I know that any time that she would have these meltdowns or any of those times, she had women in there, those two women, the pastor's wife and then another friend that she could call on. The same way I had guys that I could call on and meet with and say, knowing that there were a few years or a few months and sometimes ahead of us. So I could have those guys in my life to say, how did you get through this?
So it sounds like to me, you and Chris have a great support system. So take me back a few years. How does someone that's listening to this podcast right now, like, that's great, you have these people to lean on, but I have nobody to lean on, Greg. Yeah. I'm sitting here, I'm going through the struggle, whatever their situation is.
Right.
How did you build those relationships or find those people to lean on them? Because a lot of these people, the enemy wants us isolated and to feel alone.
Yeah.
So how do you find that person? Like, explain that a little bit, how you found your group, and when do you know it's a person you need to lean on, and when it's somebody like, hey, maybe I thought he was a good person to help me, but I need to let him go, and find somebody else.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So when I was a few years before that, we were married when I was 23. And when I was 25, we'd been married 2 years. We were in that crazy cycle trying to figure out each other, trying to figure out where we were going, where we were going to live, all that stuff. We were trying to do everything our own self, trying to be under our own umbrella instead of our mom's and dad's umbrella. I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do when I grew up. She was trying to figure out, she was already into law and doing that. She was very much more professional than I was. I mean, I'll give her that. She had it more together. In fact, when I first met her at that event, I thought, whoa, she's out of my league. But then she asked me out.
Yeah.
So the way we got through that was at 25, we showed back up to the church that we were married in. We had left that church that we were married in. We left.
So what brought you to that church? What brought you to that moment?
Yeah, there was a pastor that we heard about that they were getting a new pastor. When we came to that church, we heard this pastor, his name was Robert, and I thought, that guy's different. That guy's real. I want to meet with that guy. I went up to him. This was the first time in the church. I went up to this guy and I said, you've got something, I don't know what it is that I want. Because he started talking about, he was a PK, and he talked about, leaving home and doing, going all different ways and then coming back. And I said, you've got I just want to be around you. I don't know why. And there was things that I was fighting. One of them was being baptized. I was so fighting that. And I remember in that parking lot that day, sitting on my wife's car, on our car, because it was ours now, but sitting on her car, just bawling my eyes out, said, I don't know what this is, but I've been holding so much inside. I want to be real, and I want to grow up.
Mm-hmm.
And
okay.
So where that went is she took me in, or we went in together and we met with him.
Yeah.
He started meeting with me weekly, and then he started meeting with other guys weekly. And so because he started doing that, that's when he's the one that got me in the Word. And he started telling me 5 minutes a day. I know you can't do this, but just do 5 minutes a day. And so he was someone that I could start talking to. And
so getting plugged into a church is really the first step.
You've got to ask for it.
Yeah.
You've got to seek it.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I sought it out.
Can you? I'm gonna poke a little bit.
Yeah, go ahead.
So you mentioned you were sitting on that car. What's going through your head? What are some of the things that you were hiding? The podcast is called Out of Hiding. What was some of those things that you were pushing down, and what were some of those things?
Well, I mean, spirit of religion, really, which is, because I'd been raised, I'd already taken care of all that. I was already saved, but I wasn't walking the walk. Those were some things, and I was raised up to the time I was 11. I was raised Methodist, so I was sprinkled, and then we went to another church where they believed in being dunked, being immersed. And I said, I'm not doing that. I've already been baptized, and I fought that. And then we went to a Baptist church. I said, I'm not joining this church because they want me to get dumped. And I'm not going to. I had a lot of pride there because I was not going to let them think I was starting over, that I had a problem.
So why were you crying that day on your car?
The reason I was crying is because hearing him, Robert, talk, I could relate to him. And I'm like, that's me. I've got to move over. And so when I talked to him, he said, it's like there's a door that you're at. And he said, we all face doors in our life. And whenever we face these doors, there's a time that you've got to go through the door. You can try to go around the door, but you've got to go through the door. And that's what it was like. It's not that I had to be immersed to be, accepted in the church or join the church or I was already saved. It's like, I felt like this was an act of obedience. This was something and I was fighting it so much.
But elaborate more, because I feel like we're talking a little spiritual talk for just the average Joe listener. What does that mean? Because I get what you're saying, but I'd like to hear dumbed down just a little bit more. What you're talking about being sprinkled? That's a version of baptism, right? That's one doctrine or one sect believes, right. But I want to know, what about that got you so upset you were actually crying about it?
Because
that's the part I'm missing.
Yeah, because Robert was talking about living the way you live on Sundays all week long.
So was that a conviction?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, so you felt convicted.
I was very convicted.
So you felt like you were not living what you were preaching?
But I didn't know how to do it.
Yeah.
Because I'd grown up, like I said, I knew the right answers. I knew the right words. I'd lived in a Christian home my whole life and raised by wonderful Christian parents. I knew, I knew a lot of stuff, the right answers. But I also knew how to, tell you the right answers too of what, even though I may not be doing it, I knew the right answers.
Well, that's a common thing. Kids that grow up in ministry families or families that are very closely involved, they know all of the head stuff, but they lack the spiritual experience with God. They lack the relational.
Yeah.
Because it's just a shell game. It's just like.
My relationship was not there. I wasn't in the Word. Mm-hmm. I knew some verses, but I wasn't in the Word. Mm-hmm. I wasn't. And I didn't feel like I lived up to that. But when he was talking about being real and living a life, I tell the guys all the time that I lead now, I say, if you were convicted for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you outside of going to church on Sundays? And, it makes people think. And that's something that was asked of me and that Robert asked me. And I said, no, there wasn't at the time. I want to get that. I want people to know, yeah, I'm saved. I've got my ticket and all that stuff, but I want to live a life for him. I don't want to keep living, showing up drunk on Sundays.
So what made you get to that point? Was it misery? Was it pain? Or was it, what made you get there? Like, how did you know it was time to go see him? Did God light a bush on fire? Did he speak to you audibly? No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I would say it was.
Because people get trapped in a rut.
Yeah.
And they just something broke you out. Something got you to that point. What is that?
When I heard his story, when I heard Robert's story.
How did you hear his story, by the way?
Sitting in a service.
So what got you to that service?
Because there was a new pastor there.
So you heard, but at the time you weren't living
We were married.
So were you church looking?
Yeah.
You were.
Yeah,
so
we
you
were
were
church-
actively seeking at this
Yeah,
time.
we'd been married 2 years. We were visiting churches, trying to figure out where we wanted to settle. And I wasn't, going to parties and all that stuff anymore. I'd quit that, when we got married. We weren't doing that.
Yeah.
But it was just, we'd show up to church, and then that was really it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when there wasn't really a deep relationship there for me anyways.
And his story exposed that to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. His story talked about being real. His story talked about, just living a life that you want to live. I mean, getting past all the other stuff. And so when he did that, he was just he became a good friend of mine.
Mm-hmm.
And someone that I could call. I mean, I called him, I don't know, a year ago. I mean, he's moved on, obviously, and we've all moved on, but he's, older now. But he was probably, 16 or so years older than me.
Mm-hmm.
But
so he's real old. No,
yeah, he's real old. He is super old.
I got a question for you. This is I've never asked. We've actually never done this question before. What is the hardest thing you had to do as a Christian?
Oh, Chris talked about it a little bit.
I want it raw too.
Okay. Yeah. So when later on, going through this, getting on fire for Jesus, but throughout this time I had different mentors. From that moment on, I always found a mentor in my life. Throughout that process, several years later, I was groomed and I didn't realize it, but I was asked to join the elder board, which at the church we were going to, a couple churches after that, where the one we raised our kids in, they have the way that they don't have a committee, or it's.
When you say you was groomed but you didn't realize it, what did that look like?
So I would, just like I sought after men to mentor me.
Yeah.
That's where there was things where just hanging around, seeing how they treated their wife, seeing how they were in their quiet time, seeing the importance of spending daily time in the Word. So with that, Sam and Jan were two big mentors of mine. He's passed not long ago, but they were big mentors of mine when we went to the last church we were at. And he was an elder. She was, just a leader amongst the women. And we started hanging out with them, and they were real people. Mm-hmm. They were, he was a vice president of a company. He knew how to be an executive and work he was from a sales arena, which is where I was from, and raised kids. And I thought I want to raise my kids like that. I want to work like he's worked, have that work ethic, throughout the week, but also do those things.
So he mentored the heck out of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He mentored. So what it was he would hang. He was one so one time I was doing a job change. The first guy I called was Sam.
Gotcha.
I said, hey, here's what they're offering me. Here's, I had a good relationship with my parents, but they were like mine and Chris's parents together. And I could call him and I could ask him marriage questions. I could ask him, some of the harder questions. And so throughout that time, his wife told me, said, someday you're going to be an elder. And I thought, whatever. I thought, that's not me. I'm not a church leader. And, several years over time, he was spending time with me, spending daily time. And then he asked me, we got into leading young marrieds. So we would lead these, not a conference, but with them, we would lead these, Emerson Eggerichs, what's the Ephesians? Love and Respect. I don't know if you've ever read the book Love and Respect, but there's a whole study that you can go through. We would lead these, have a big room full of where we would lead these people. Well, he would push me and say, you're going to lead this. And really.
So he was just spending time.
Yeah. Doing a lot of that.
Raising you up. So more mentoring than grooming.
Yeah, I shouldn't say grooming.
Yeah, when I heard that term, I was like, well, was it when I hear grooming, I think someone's doing it with manipulative intent. This is more of a mentorship.
Teaching me how to treat his wife.
Yeah, just
teaching me how to manage, be responsible financially.
Gotcha.
Teaching me how to treat your kids. Teach me how to discipline your kids. He taught me, my parents, I felt like were good disciplinarians. They discipline well.
Did he teach you anything looking back now? You were like, yeah, he might have missed it on that one, but.
Hang on, we got to get to the hardest thing first.
Oh yeah, that's right.
Yeah, I'm not letting that
we got sidetracked.
So the hardest thing, when they asked me to be on the elder board, which is the governing body of the church, I said, that's not me. And anyways, it took a while for me to join, for me to come on board. When I finally came on board, one of the elders said, that we've got several men on here that are older, getting near, 70 and 60. And he said, we're going to have to make some hard decisions. He said, are you okay doing that? I said, yeah, that's no problem. And when that time came, when we started having to talk about direction of the church and making decisions like that and having people terminate people who it was their livelihood, that's hard. These are people I knew, I went to church with, and then now you're telling them, sorry, you don't have a job anymore.
So the elders got paid?
No, we didn't.
Oh,
no, we were the senior pastor reported to the elder. He was one of the elders.
Oh, okay. So you're talking about the elders had to let some of the paid staff go.
Yeah.
Oh, I misunderstood. Yeah, I was thinking you had to let the elders. No, the elders go.
We had to let some. We had Chris told you about our previous senior pastor who, had the affair and all that stuff, and that had happened. All that happened right before I got on board. Sam, who was my mentor, he was the chairman of the board. He was he was right there with all that. I watched that, not on from the board, but I watched that. Well, then we had some other staff members that we had to let go, make some decisions. And when you're doing that, and then throughout that time, having, one we let go because they were having an affair with another staff member. And then you're getting church members hitting you, friends and all your people hitting you, and you getting all kinds of phone calls. Hey, why'd you do that? And you have to be able to maintain a confidentiality, and two, a maturity of why you made those decisions while still being their friend, while still being a leader. So
they weren't privy to the whole thing.
No.
And it wasn't out there. So you had to make this decision, and they're upset because you just fired somebody they liked, but they didn't know what had happened.
Yeah. We told them a lot of the reasons. Mm-hmm. But, for that person's dignity, there were a lot of the guys that we'd fired were personality issues among staff. They were just weren't jiving, just weren't cutting it, weren't doing their job in some cases. And to be able to open that can up, one, you've got an HR issue. You got to be careful with what you share. And then two, you've got a person issue. That a lot of people in that church follow and love. Mm-hmm. And then you've got your friend who, some of these men and women that we had, they had people that had mentored me at one time or another. And here I am, part of the leadership, the 6-8 guys that were now
putting them on the chopping block.
Yeah. That's hard when you do that. And then you've still got to maintain the next Sunday walking in and telling everybody Jesus loves you. Yeah. But there's that side of you, you've got to be able to maintain that leadership role, but you've also got to maintain that confidentiality, but you've got to do what's right for the church. And you've dealt with this, I'm sure. Adam's dealt with this, to where you make decisions sometimes that may not always be the easy thing to make, or may not be the best decisions. And there may have been some things that we thought we could have probably handled that different. You see that maybe a year or a month down the road. When you look back, you think, Yeah, we probably didn't do that the best of ways. We probably should have done a different way or announced it a different way. Or, hindsight's always 2020 after it's done, but you've just got to, after a lot of prayer and making those kind of decisions, you've got to say, this is the right direction. We know we may lose some people. We hope we don't, but we may lose some people, but this is where we're going and this is why. And this is what, and then does that answer your question?
Yeah. No, I imagine that would very hard. You just get on, you're new, and you're like at the chopping block.
Was that harder to deal with than getting over your lead pastor having a failure? I mean, that had to be hard too. I don't know how close you were to that man.
Yeah. Yes, because, in some ways it was still connected, because part of what happened that time between when he left, was asked to leave, and they allowed him to resign. When he resigned, and a lot of these other guys that had been were still on staff, a lot of these other associate pastors that were still on staff, felt like they should have had his job. And so you were dealing with that, because what ended up happening was, right before I got on, they went outside and brought in someone else to be the senior pastor. So now you've got this new senior pastor who became a mentor. That's the one that Chris confided in. And so he had a mess on his hands, because now he had all these guys that didn't really like him because he just stole their job. And so now he was the leader.
Welcome to ministry.
Right. Yeah, it's if it wasn't for
church right there.
Well, if it wasn't for people, church would be easy. But you've got to deal with that, and so that's part of what. So yeah, it was still connected to that affair, because that's where it all started. But even past the affair, there were so many other things that came out. That, I mean, it was just rumblings. And that's one thing. We had a pastor from outside the next Sunday after the affair was announced. We had a pastor from outside that came in and preached a message I'll never forget. He'll say, "This is like an earthquake." He said, when you have an earthquake, you still have tremors afterwards. And sometimes the tremors may happen months and years. And those were some of the tremors, because we quoted him so much after that, because we saw it so often, time after time, when you
So the church
had that.
All that got exposed, and they were all hurt.
Yeah.
But they all got restored. Is that an accurate statement?
They were in a restoring process. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
They were. This is when you can hit a nerve. This is when Chris, she talked a little bit about it. When you're in that position and you're having to make certain decisions, and you're getting blasted by people and saying hurtful things from friends, and not wanting to divide the church. To say, when COVID happened, that revealed a lot. A lot of personalities came out of the woodwork. A lot of things people were saying that's like, where did this come from? And you just see all these things that were hiding in the, you talk about out of hiding. You see all these things, these emotions, and some of them that have been bottled up for years and months that started coming out. And you started seeing things within the church. And it's like, holy cow, this is we got some issues here. And then you start seeing some of that come out. And then you start seeing the way things are done amongst the leaders. It's like, this is wrong. We can't do this. And that's when... it was kind of between us, when I was having to, make some calls, about opening and, all that stuff. And it's not even it's just the way we were doing it. And, I had people coming to me, and I wanted so badly to tell them how I personally felt. Some of my conviction. Huh?
Why didn't you? Just curious.
Because I didn't want to split the church. Because there were people that I could have easily said, this is what these four are saying, what they want to do. I want to say this, because then it's me against them. And it would have been a big group of people saying, oh, yeah, I believe that too. I feel your way. So what I did is I said, I tell you what you do. I said, I think you need to write a letter to the board. I said, write a letter to the board and let us all hear your valid concern. And that scared the heck out of our senior pastor when that happened, because he got several letters. We had a meeting after those letters. He says, we've never gotten these kind of letters before. He said, we've got a crisis on our hands. And I said, yeah, we do. I said, we need to listen to the people. I said, yes, we have to make decisions, but we need to get out there and listen to the people. You've got to, at least let them be heard. And, when we were shutting down, we shut down when when we had to shut down, when we didn't have a choice. We shut down then. But then we had people saying, why are we still shut down? We want to do this. And I kept going to the board and saying, let's put it out there to the body and see what they want to do. I said, we've got, cameras. We can have video services for those that don't want to come. They said, no, we can't. We can't do that. We've got to start taking temps at the door. I said, this is crazy. I said, if they don't want to come, they don't have to come. And they said, well, we need to ask for, if they've, test them, do they have tests, and do they have, temps, and do they have, we got to mask them, and we got to, all this stuff. I said, this is a church. This is not what we stand up for. I said, I don't have a problem if somebody walks in here with a mask on. I said, God bless them, love them, bring them to church. I don't care what they wear. If they want to sit 6 feet, 10 feet, whatever away, that's them. Let's get them into church. We need people here worshiping. But if they don't feel comfortable, they can worship at home. And that wasn't, they said, no, not without doing all that. I said, we need to ask the people what they're willing to do. And I said, I guarantee you've got a large percentage of the people that want to come to church. And they said, I don't believe that. I said, let's ask them.
What was your breaking point? Because Chris briefly said, a little bit about that story. What was your breaking point where enough is enough?
When we opened one Sunday, and then we had a meeting. They wouldn't even meet in person, which was crazy. And I said, this is ridiculous. I said, anyways, I said, we need to meet in person. We need to pray together in person. I said, I'm willing to meet wherever. I don't care if we meet outside. We need to be praying together more in person. I said, you guys are scared to death of doing this, and you're getting your information off of what's out there. Instead, we need to be praying together. And I said, I'm not trying to twist you into my way of thinking at all, but I said, we've got a church here that's got a lot of members. I said, let's listen to where the majority of them are. If you've got the majority of your members that want to meet no matter what, I said, let them meet. And when they didn't want to do that, they said, we need to shut it down again because numbers are rising. The COVID numbers and all that stuff were rising. And I said, really? One Sunday, and they said, well, we can reopen as long as we have someone stand at the door and take temperatures, and then we make sure they have masks. I said, we are not policing this member. They are grown adults. They can come in here and do that. I said, we're not doing it. I said, I refuse to do that to those people. I said, these people are coming because they're already hurt, and then they're looking for Jesus. I said, we need to show them Jesus. I said, if we really believe and have the faith that we do, I said, we will, let them come and be adults and make the decisions. They see all the reports. If, we have videos, and they wouldn't do it. And when people kept coming to me and saying, why are we not opening? I said, I would love to open. I said, the majority of the board will not. And they said, who? And I would not throw them under the bus. And so when that started happening, we shut down. That's when, Chris's mom and dad, they go here. And I was talking to them. Because that's a very lonely place to be. Because I refused to get my camp within the church. I could have easily, and I knew who a lot of them were, I could have easily said, hey, let's band together and let's
revolt.
Yeah. We're going to go against these other men because here's what they're doing. That's not healthy for the church. That is dividing the church. That's going to split the church. That's not healthy. I said, I can't do that. I said, I'm not going to do that. I said, you can send letters to the board, but I'm not going to go against my brothers. I said, this is who I am. I am a member of this church, and I'm called as a leader, and we're leading together. Yes, we have our differences, but I'm not going to do that. And so Chris and Mom, they were like one of the few people I could talk to, just because I didn't want to talk to people because even my closest friends, because I couldn't tell them.
It was too hot of a subject.
It was too hot of a subject, and it would be one of those, oh, you can tell me. And then they would, hey, don't tell anybody. And it would be like
wildfire.
Yes. And I said, I can't tell you. I cannot talk about this. Chris knew. She was on staff. She knew. She knew most of it. There was some stuff I couldn't. I just didn't want to even tell her. Because I didn't want to change her image of people she worked for. She was on staff, and I said, I just can't. I can't share everything with you because I don't want you to have a different impersonation of your boss or, any of your coworkers. I said, once this is all over, what's that going to be like? That's not healthy at all. And so I would talk to her mom and dad a lot. But the first Sunday, they said, well, we're open out here. And so we came out on a Sunday to Radiant and just sat in the service and wept. There's about 100 people in there. It was during the pallets. When you have pallets on the wall. But
Good time.
You were on stage. You were on the platform. Jesse was there. I don't even remember who. Marcus was probably there.
If it was a day and there was drums being played, it was probably Marcus.
Yeah.
He's a machine.
But yeah, so we came to Radiant, cried the entire time. Just, we hadn't worshiped with music. And yeah, it was crazy how you don't realize how you miss worship until you don't have it. And then I heard Adam's message and I said, I want to talk to this guy. So I went up afterwards and just, cried on him. And, there's only 100 people in the room, and cried on him and told him, I said, here's what I'm dealing with. I said, and he prayed for me. And then next Sunday, so, well, we're still closed. What do you want to do? And we were having Zoom meetings. And she was doing her staff stuff. And as long as she didn't have to be there, I'd say, where do you want to go? Well, let's just go back to Canton. So, we'd visit a church here, and everything was based on what we saw here. Because when you walked in the door, you felt the presence of the Holy Spirit. And I hear so many people say that when they walk in that door as I greet. And so time after time, we did that for... When we finally made the decision to go here, we said, we're going to go there. And we weren't even talking about moving yet, but we were going here, and we did the hour-and-a-half drive every Sunday for a year. And yeah, so. Wow. And then over that time, I finally resigned, and Chris resigned too.
It's obvious there's a lot of pain there. I could feel it in the room. I could see it on you. What did you learn? I know hindsight's 20/20, and I don't believe things just happen. What lesson did you learn of overcoming pain and hurt and hardship? What lesson did you learn going through all that now has become a part of your testimony that you can share with others? I mean, there's multiple lessons here, but what did you get to take away that now has become a part of your testimony that you can use to help others?
I would say get people in your life that you can have as a, sounding board, people you really trust, know that. And then that's one thing. The other thing that, in Freedom Ministry, when we started in Freedom Ministry, I was in training and they asked me to sit for a session. And I said, okay, I'll do it. I'll volunteer. And I said, I'll do it. I said, but I don't know what we're going to talk about, And Chris said, you need to talk about your church hurt. I said, I've taken care of that. I've dealt with that. And when first thing, when we sat in a session, they started doing that. And what I was able to do is forgive. Now, yes, it hurts when I think about going back to those, but every one of those men I love, I respect, and I've forgiven them. And that's a big thing, is to be able to, you've got, there's things in your past that you've dealt with, but you've got to forgive. It doesn't mean it's going to make it feel better.
Those
go away.
men that you had to forgive,
yeah.
Is it fair to say at one point they were part of your circle?
Oh, yeah.
So my question is, when your close circle that you've relied on and they've been your sounding board, when they hurt or fail you, how do you overcome that? How'd you get past that?
Well,
you're kind of going in a little bit, but I want to pinpoint it down just a little bit more.
So I went and I talked to them.
Mm-hmm.
I talked to the senior pastor and our chairman of the elder. I shared with them, and they were blinded.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't see it. And at that time I realized, I forgive you. I love you. And this is where I have to leave. I'm not going to stay here and fight this, because I know it, it's not a matter of who's winning, who's going to win this. It's like, this is not worth dividing a church over. I mean, and they're still hurting, that church is. But I had to remove myself from it, set my pride down, and, through inner healing, just be able to lay it down at Jesus's feet and not pick it back up. Gotcha. And I can talk about it. Yeah, I still get emotional. But I don't walk around with that resentment. I don't walk around with that anger that I had against them. If I see them, which I've seen some of them, I can truly look them in the eye and shake their hand. I can give them a hug. I've given them a hug, some of them, the ones that I've seen. I can look at their picture and not think, I can think, what, I hope they do well. I hope that church thrives.
So one takeaway, if somebody listening's gone through that, and they're hurting right now, and they're back where you were, what piece of advice would you give to them right now? Just to help to encourage them to see them through. What would that be?
One thing is talk to someone about it that you trust.
Mm-hmm. Maybe outside of this arena.
Outside the arena.
Yeah.
Talk to someone. Find people that you are trust. Be honest. Be honest with what's going on, and then be willing to forgive. Mm-hmm. And when I say forgive, I mean, set it. We have a thing in Freedom Ministry of set it down at Jesus's feet and leave it there. Stop picking it up, because so much of the time we want to set it down, but then we want to keep a string tied to it. And when that event, I want to hold that again, because that, now you got to set it down and cut that string. You've got to realize that, one thing that I've heard the Lord say is, I've got this. It's not your burden to carry anymore. It's not your, I've removed you from it. And that's the thing, when you leave something like that, you've got to be able to leave it. You've got to forgive. Mm-hmm. It doesn't justify I'm not saying what you did was right or what I did was right. I'm not trying to justify or, set my stake in the ground. Yeah, there were probably things that I did and said that were wrong, that were, just spiteful or whatever. I've confessed that. But you've got to do that. Confess it, leave it at Jesus' feet, and then move on. Take what you can learn and look for opportunities how you can speak into other people's lives based on what you went through.
Greg, we're getting short on time. Would you like to tell us a little bit about your side of the Freedom Ministries with what time we got left?
I can.
You've been awesome, man. Your honesty and your candor. I know I visibly could see we poked a spot that's probably a little tender. I'm sorry.
No.
But thank you so much, because, the truth of the matter is we're all human.
Yeah.
We all make mistakes. Those close to us are going to let us down from time to time. And, as Christians, we're called to the high road, to be able to learn how to forgive and learn how to heal and learn how to move through that.
Right. I would say in Freedom Ministry, the biggest thing I've seen people do, Chris said it's weird. I don't think it's weird. All it is, it's a session just like this, where we're sitting with people and we're praying together. We don't get into the, I know that we had a situation where some things got loud and crazy, and we don't do the power encounters. We don't do the throwing ups. We don't do, it's a sit down with a session, and we pray and we listen and say, okay, what do you think, Jesus? Pray and ask Jesus what he's got for you. What do you want to deal with today? Mm-hmm. And we've had it. I mean, a good example is we had someone once that came in and they were coming to fix someone else, a sibling or a child. And we ended up dealing with stuff with them that they had to deal with, that they didn't realize that they were carrying, some anger issues. So sometimes it's anger. You've got to deal with those anger things. Maybe it was.
So you're basically getting in the room and you're coming together as believers, and you're just asking the Holy Spirit to reveal, to show things that might be. So that's just biblical.
Yeah. So what do you have? What are some burdens maybe that you're carrying that you
might not know you're carrying?
Yeah. Set at the feet, whether it's things from your past, maybe it's childhood things. There's things from my childhood that I've been able to let go of. There's things that I learned about certain, family that I've been able to forgive and let that go. We've had people that have, we've had a lot of people get saved, because the first question we ask them is, tell us how you found and fell in love with Jesus. And they start to tell us, and we think, so you talk about God, what do you know about Jesus? And when they start talking, they don't know if they're a believer, and we've led them to Christ. That's the first thing we do. But we've had people get healed. We've had people let go of fears. We've had physical healings where, I was healed of a knee injury. We've had physical healings. We've had, all kinds of just emotional things. And usually the way I'll say is, you walk in there with 50 pounds of stuff. We may not deal with all 50 pounds. We may just deal with 5 pounds. But we just say, ask Jesus what he wants to deal with. And we pray. And then we say, what are you hearing? And every time they say, well, I'm hearing this. And we just start asking questions. Well, ask Jesus what that means. And it's pretty amazing. Wow. But it's very calm.
Well, Greg, that's going to probably wrap it up. I got one more question for you real quick. How hard was it to get Chris delivered from the dancing at the bars? I'm totally kidding, by the way.
She's actually a good dancer.
Thanks for coming on today, man. We love you.
All right.
Appreciate
love y'all
your time.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
This has been good.
Yeah, good.
All right.
See ya.
All right.